January 1945. Somewhere in the French countryside, near the Belgian border. The frost had settled early that year. It clung to the broken stone walls of a requisition chateau, its once grand windows now patched with canvas and wooden planks. Inside, in a vast hall that had once hosted balls and banquets, 200 German women sat in silence. They wore the tattered remnants of Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms, Nachrichtenfelferin, signal operators, Stabshelferin, administrative clerks, nurses whose red crosses had faded to rust-colored ghosts on filthy fabric. Their hands, red and swollen from cold, clutched thin blankets issued by their American captors. Outside, the wind carried the distant rumble of artillery, a war still raging. Still consuming, still unforgiving. Christmas was 10 days away, for these women. The word carried a weight far heavier than nostalgia. Christmas in captivity meant uncertainty. It meant vulnerability. In the fevered propaganda of Joseph Goebbels, in the whispered warnings of their officers before surrender, they had been told what awaited them in enemy hands. The Americans, they were told, were barbaric. The women would be humiliated, starved, perhaps worse. The Reich had painted the Allies as devils in democratic clothing. And now, stripped of their nation, their purpose, and their protection, these women sat in the cold December air and waited to learn if the devils were real. But something unexpected was stirring in that commandeered chateau. American soldiers, young men from Iowa and Texas and Brooklyn, had begun dragging fir branches through the snow. Crates marked with U.S. Army insignia were being pried open in the kitchens. The smell of roasting meat, real meat, not the ersatz rations the women had known for years, began to drift through the stone corridors. And the women, hardened by years of war, by the sight of cities turned to ash and the sounds of dying men, found themselves uncertain whether to feel hope or fear. This is the story of that Christmas. It is a story not of grand strategy or sweeping battles, but of a collision between two worlds, one starved and indoctrinated, the other abundant and bewildering. It is the story of what happened when young American soldiers, themselves far from home, chose to give their enemies a holiday. And it is the story of how that single act of unexpected humanity became a turning point, not in the outcome of the war, but in the hearts of those who lived through it. By the winter of 1944, the machinery of the Third Reich was grinding to a halt. The Wehrmacht, once the most feared military force on the planet, was collapsing under the weight of its own ambitions. In the East, the Red Army was an unstoppable tide. In the West, American and British forces had broken through German defenses and were driving toward the Rhine. And as the front lines disintegrated, thousands upon thousands of German soldiers, civilians, auxiliary personnel were being swept into Allied captivity. Among them were the women. They had been the invisible backbone of Hitler's war machine. They had operated switchboards, decoded messages, typed orders, and bandaged the wounded. They had been told they were serving the fatherland, that their work was honorable, necessary, vital. They had been promised that the Reich would protect them. But the Reich was dying, and now they were prisoners. The treatment of female POWs was a delicate matter. The Geneva Conventions of 1929 mandated humane treatment of prisoners of war, but those conventions had been written with male combatants in mind. Women occupied a strange, precarious space in the brutal calculus of war. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, yet they wore uniforms and had served the enemy. They were vulnerable in ways that male prisoners were not, yet military bureaucracies were ill-equipped to address those vulnerabilities. And so, the women found themselves in a kind of limbo, housed in makeshift camps, guarded by men who had been trained to fight, not to care for frightened. Exhausted women far from home, the American approach to these prisoners was shaped by a peculiar mixture of pragmatism and idealism. On the pragmatic side, the United States Army understood that mistreating POWs would undermine the broader effort to win the peace. Eisenhower himself had emphasized that the world was watching, that the Allies must demonstrate moral superiority over the fascist regimes they were defeating. On the idealistic side, many American soldiers carried with them a deeply ingrained belief in fair play, in the notion that even enemies deserved basic decency. It was a belief shaped by American civics classes, by Hollywood westerns, by a culture that, for all its flaws, celebrated the idea of the underdog in the fair fight. But beliefs are one thing. Reality is another. And in the cold, chaotic winter of 1944, as the Battle of the Bulge raged and resources were stretched thin, the American soldiers tasked with guarding German POWs had every reason to view their captives with suspicion, even hostility. These were the people who had manned the war machine that killed their brothers, who had cheered for Hitler, who had believed in a 1,000-year Reich. Compassion, under such circumstances, was not inevitable. It was a choice. The women in the chateau near the Belgian border did not expect compassion. They expected survival at best. At worst, they expected the horrors that Goebbels' propaganda ministry had burned into their imaginations for years. The Reich's propaganda machine had worked overtime to demonize the Allies, particularly the Americans. Goebbels had painted them as a mongrel nation, a chaotic assemblage of races and cultures held together only by greed and material excess. American soldiers, the propaganda claimed, were undisciplined brutes, motivated not by honor or duty, but by a crude desire for conquest and plunder. American women, the propaganda insisted, were promiscuous and degraded, and American men treated women as commodities. The implication was clear. German women in American hands would face humiliation and abuse. This was not idle propaganda. It was strategic terror, designed to discourage surrender and stiffen resistance. And it worked. Many German women, as the war turned against the Reich, had heard stories, some true, some exaggerated, some entirely fabricated, of what happened to women occupied territories. Soviet treatment of German women in the East was genuinely brutal, a fact that gave credibility to the broader narrative that all enemy forces were barbaric. The women in the chateau had no way of knowing that American conduct was governed by different principles. All they knew was fear, and so, as December deepened and Christmas approached, the women braced themselves. They had learned to endure. They had endured the Allied bombing campaigns that turned their cities into infernos. They had endured the loss of fathers, brothers, sons. They had endured the slow, gnawing realization that the Führer's promises were lies. Now they would endure captivity. They asked for nothing. They expected nothing. What they did not expect was a Christmas tree. It began with a young lieutenant from Pennsylvania, a man named Robert Hartman. He was 24 years old, a former schoolteacher who had enlisted in 1942 and had seen his share of combat in France. By December of 1944, he was assigned to oversee the security and logistics of the POW camp housed in the chateau. It was not glamorous work. It involved managing supplies, coordinating guard rotations, and ensuring that the prisoners, mostly women, were adequately fed and sheltered. Hartman was not a sentimental man. He had seen too much for sentimentality. But he was observant, and he noticed the way the German women moved through the camp like ghosts. They were quiet, obedient, almost eerily compliant. They avoided eye contact. They spoke in whispers. They carried themselves as though expecting punishment at any moment. One evening, as Hartman walked through the main hall of the chateau, he overheard two of his soldiers talking. They were discussing Christmas, debating whether they would receive packages from home in time for the holiday. One of them, a kid from Ohio named Miller, mentioned that his mother always sent fruitcake. The other, a wiry Texan named Briggs, laughed and said he hoped for whiskey. Hartman stopped. Christmas. He had not given it much thought. The war did not pause for holidays. But now, standing in that cold, drafty hall, surrounded by the silent presence of 200 frightened women, An idea took root. What if they gave the prisoners Christmas? It was an absurd idea on the face of it. Resources were tight. The Battle of the Bulge was consuming men and materiel at a staggering rate. And these were enemy prisoners after all. They did not deserve a holiday. They deserved adequate shelter, sufficient food, medical care, nothing more. But Hartman could not shake the thought. He had been raised in a household that took Christmas seriously. His mother had always insisted on decorations, on a proper meal, on the rituals that marked the season. And he found himself wondering what message it would send, not just to the prisoners, but to his own men if they simply ignored the holiday. Would it not confirm the propaganda, the idea that Americans were cold, mechanized, indifferent? He brought the idea to his commanding officer, a gruff colonel named Daniels. Daniels listened, frowning, and then shook his head. "Lieutenant, we're not running a charity. These women are prisoners. We feed them, we house them, we follow the Geneva Conventions. That's it." "I understand, sir," Hartman replied. "But what if we could do more? What if we showed them something they didn't expect?" Daniels regarded him for a long moment. Then he sighed. "What are you proposing?" "A Christmas meal. Decorations, maybe a tree. Nothing extravagant, sir. Just enough to show them we're not monsters." Daniels rubbed his jaw. "You think they'd even appreciate it?" "I don't know, sir. But I think it's worth finding out." In the end, Daniels agreed, with one condition. Hartman and his men would have to organize it themselves, using whatever resources they could scrounge. The army would not officially sanction it. If it went wrong, Hartman would take the blame. Hartman accepted the terms. The preparations began in secret. Hartman and a handful of his soldiers started by foraging for a Christmas tree. They found a scraggly fir on the edge of a nearby forest and hauled it back to the chateau. It was not a majestic tree. Its branches were uneven, its needles sparse, but it was a tree nonetheless. They set it up in the corner of the main hall. And the women, seeing it for the first time, stopped and stared. One of the prisoners, a woman named Inge Moeller, later recalled the moment in a letter written years after the war. "We did not know what to make of it," she wrote. "We thought perhaps it was a joke or a trick. We had been taught that the Americans were cruel, and we could not understand why they would bring us a tree." Some of the women wept. I do not think they even knew why. The soldiers began decorating the tree with whatever they could find. They cut strips of colored paper from old supply manifests. They fashioned stars from tin cans. One of the men, a carpenter before the war, whittled small wooden ornaments. Another soldier, a Catholic from Massachusetts, donated a small cross from his personal belongings. The tree, by the time they finished, was a strange, makeshift creation, a patchwork of military surplus and improvised sentiment. But it was undeniably a Christmas tree. The women watched in silence as the soldiers worked. They did not help. They did not speak. They simply watched, as though witnessing something incomprehensible. The next step was the meal. This proved more difficult. Army rations were notoriously utilitarian: canned meat, powdered eggs, hardtack. Not the stuff of Christmas feasts. But Hartman and his men were resourceful. They bartered with supply sergeants, traded cigarettes for canned ham, negotiated with the camp cook for access to flour and sugar. They pooled their own rations, sacrificing their own comfort for the sake of the plan. One soldier, a farm boy from Nebraska named Jack Sullivan, managed to procure a live chicken from a nearby village. He wrung its neck himself, plucked it, and roasted it over an open fire. Another soldier, whose father had been a baker, used the flour to make rolls, real rolls, soft and warm. The kind the German women had not tasted in years. On the morning of Christmas Eve, the smell of roasting meat filled the chateau. The women, assembled in the main hall, could not hide their confusion. They whispered among themselves, speculating. Was this a reward, a test? A prelude to something worse? Hartmann stood before them, flanked by his soldiers. He spoke in halting German, a language he had learned poorly in school but had improved during his months in Europe. "Tonight," he said, "we will celebrate Christmas. You are far from home. So are we. But tonight we will eat together. Tonight we will remember what it means to be human." The women did not respond. They simply stared. The meal was served that evening. Long tables, borrowed from the chateau's storage rooms, were set up in the main hall. The tree, now fully decorated, stood in the corner, its makeshift ornaments catching the light of kerosene lamps. The German women were seated first, and then the American soldiers brought out the food. There was roasted chicken, Sullivan's contribution. There was canned ham, heated and sliced. There were rolls, still warm from the oven. There were canned vegetables, sweetened with a touch of sugar. There was even coffee, real coffee, not the acorn substitute the women had been drinking for years. And for dessert, there were tins of fruitcake, donated by soldiers who had received them in care packages from home. The women ate slowly, cautiously, as though afraid the food might be taken away. Many of them cried. Some prayed quietly. One woman, a nurse named Greta Hoffmann, later described the meal as the first moment in years when I felt like a person, not a cog in a machine. She wrote that the simple act of being served food, of being treated with care, was more powerful than any propaganda speech or ideological lecture. The American soldiers did not eat with the prisoners. They stood along the walls, watching. Some of them looked uncomfortable. These were women who had served the enemy, after all. But others, most, perhaps looked something close to proud. After the meal, one of the soldiers, a man from Louisiana who played the harmonica, began to play Silent Night. The tune was familiar to everyone in the room. It was, after all, a German carol. The women, hesitant at first, began to hum along. And then, quietly, they began to sing. Their voices, thin and uncertain at first, grew stronger. The soldiers, many of whom did not know the German words, joined in with the English version. For a few minutes, the war seemed very far away. The Christmas celebration in that chateau did not change the course of the war. It did not hasten Germany's defeat or save a single life on the battlefield. But it changed something else. It changed the way the women saw their captors. And perhaps more importantly, it changed the way the women saw themselves. For years, they had been told that they were part of a glorious struggle, that they were serving a higher purpose. The Reich had given them identity, structure, meaning. And when the Reich collapsed, that meaning collapsed with it. They were left adrift, stripped of the narrative that had sustained them. In the camps, in the chaos of defeat, they had become nothing, faceless, nameless. Disposable. But that Christmas meal, that absurd improvised celebration, reminded them of something they had nearly forgotten. It reminded them that they were human, that they were individuals with names and histories and worth. The Americans, by treating them with kindness, by sharing their own meager resources, had given them back a piece of their humanity. Inge Muller, the woman who later wrote about the Christmas tree, described the experience as a kind of awakening. For so long, she wrote, I had believed what we were told, that the Allies were animals, that they hated us, that they would destroy us. But that night, I realized that I had been lied to. These men, these American soldiers, had shown me more kindness than my own government ever had. Greta Hoffmann, the nurse, echoed this sentiment. I had been prepared to die in captivity, she wrote. I thought that was my fate. But when I saw that tree, when I tasted that food, I realized that I wanted to live. I wanted to go home. I wanted to rebuild. The transformation was not universal, of course. Some of the women remained suspicious, convinced that the kindness was a ruse or a manipulation. Some held on to their ideological convictions. unable or unwilling to reconcile what they were experiencing with what they had been taught. But for many, perhaps most, the Christmas celebration marked a turning point. It was the moment when the propaganda began to crack, when the lies they had been fed started to lose their power. The symbolism of food loomed large in the women's memories. Food had been a weapon in the war, a tool of control and deprivation. The Reich had rationed food ruthlessly, prioritizing soldiers and party officials while civilians scraped by on ever-diminishing supplies. The women had grown accustomed to hunger, to the hollow ache that never quite went away. And they had been told that the Allies, too, would use food as a weapon, that prisoners would be starved, punished, broken. But the Americans did not starve them. They fed them, and not just adequately generously. The Christmas meal was only the most dramatic example. In the weeks and months that followed, the women in the camp were given rations that exceeded what they had received under the Reich. There was white bread, not the coarse black bread they had known. There was real coffee, not ersatz. There was chocolate, a luxury most of them had not tasted in years. One woman, a former switchboard operator named Liesl Brown, later recalled her astonishment at the abundance. "We could not understand where it all came from," she said in an interview conducted in the 1970s. "We had been told that America was weak, that it was falling apart, that it could not sustain the war. But then we saw the food, the supplies, the sheer quantity of everything. And we realized we had been lied to. The food became a symbol of something larger, a symbol of American capacity, of the vast industrial and agricultural machine that undergirded the Allied war effort. For the German women, raised on a diet of scarcity and sacrifice, the abundance was almost incomprehensible. It challenged their understanding of the world, of what was possible. And it raised uncomfortable questions about the system they had served. If the Reich had been as strong as they were told, why had there been so little food? If Germany was the master race, destined to rule Europe, why had they been hungry while the Americans, the supposed mongrels, were so well fed? The answers, when the women allowed themselves to confront them, were devastating. Spring came to the French countryside, and with it, the end of the war. Germany surrendered in May of 1945, and the women in the camp were processed for repatriation. They would return to a country that no longer existed, to cities reduced to rubble, to a future utterly uncertain. But they would return with something unexpected, a memory of kindness. A memory of American soldiers who had chosen, against all reason and expectation, to treat them with decency. That memory would shape their lives in ways large and small. Some of the women became advocates for reconciliation, working in the post-war years to bridge the divide between former enemies. Others simply carried the memory quietly, a private counterweight to the bitterness of defeat. Greta Hoffmann, the nurse, eventually emigrated to the United States in the 1950s. She settled in Ohio, married an American veteran, and spent the rest of her life working in hospitals. In interviews, she always returned to that Christmas in the chateau. "It was the moment I understood that the war was not between good and evil," she said. "It was between people who had been taught to hate and people who chose not to." Liesl Brown, the switchboard operator, remained in Germany. She became a schoolteacher, dedicating her life to educating young Germans about the war. She often spoke to her students about the Christmas in captivity, using it as a lesson about the power of small acts of humanity. "The Americans did not have to give us that meal," she would tell her classes. "They did it because they believed in something. They believed that even enemies deserve dignity." Inge Muller, who had written about the Christmas tree, became a journalist. She spent years documenting the experiences of German women during and after the war. In one of her articles, published in the 1960s, she reflected on the broader meaning of that Christmas. "We were told that democracy was weak, that it was decadent, that it could not compete with the strength of the Reich," she wrote. "But what we learned in that camp was that democracy's strength lies not in cruelty, but in kindness. Not in domination, but in respect. The Americans did not defeat us with guns alone. They defeated us with decency. The story of that Christmas might have been lost to history, buried among the countless small dramas of the war. But in the decades that followed, as historians began to interview survivors and sift through archives, the story emerged. It became a footnote, a curious anecdote, a reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity could flicker to life. For the American soldiers involved, the Christmas celebration was rarely discussed. Most of them returned home, resumed their lives, and spoke little of the war. Robert Hartman, the lieutenant who had initiated the plan, became a high school principal in Pennsylvania. He did not think of himself as a hero. He had simply done what seemed right at the time. But in the 1980s, a German filmmaker tracked him down and asked him about the Christmas in the chateau. Hartman, by then an old man, seemed surprised that anyone cared. "We just wanted to show them we weren't monsters," he said. "That's all. We wanted them to know that we were human beings, same as them." The filmmaker pressed him. Did he think it had made a difference? Hartman thought for a long moment. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe, maybe not. But I'd like to think it did." There is a photograph taken on that Christmas Eve in 1945 that survives in the U.S. National Archives. It is grainy, poorly lit, but it captures the scene with startling clarity. The Christmas tree stands in the corner, its makeshift ornaments barely visible. The long tables are crowded with women, their faces gaunt, but strangely peaceful. And along the walls, the American soldiers stand, watching. It is a photograph of a moment suspended between two worlds. On one side, the ideology of hatred, the machinery of war, the conviction that enemies must be crushed. On the other, the simple, stubborn belief that kindness matters, that humanity endures, that even in the midst of devastation, there is room for grace. The women in that photograph would carry that moment with them for the rest of their lives. And in carrying it, they would become living refutations of the propaganda that had defined their youth. They had been told that Americans were barbaric, that democracy was weak, that only the strong deserved to survive. But they had learned, in a cold chateau on Christmas Eve, that strength could take many forms. That abundance was not just a matter of resources, but of generosity. That freedom was not the absence of order, but the presence of choice, including the choice to show mercy. The war ended. The prisoners went home. The chateau was eventually returned to its owners, who repaired the damage and restored it to something approaching its former grandeur. The Christmas tree, of course, was discarded, tossed onto a bonfire, most likely, or left to rot in the woods. The decorations, the tin stars and paper chains, were swept away and forgotten, but the memory endured. Not in official histories, not in grand monuments, but in the quiet recollections of the women who had been there. They told their children about it, and their grandchildren. They wrote letters and gave interviews. They insisted, against the passage of time and the fading of memory, that it had mattered, and perhaps they were right. Perhaps in the end, the war was decided not just by tanks and planes and the grim calculus of attrition, but by moments like these. Moments when one side chose to see the other not as monsters, but as people. Moments when kindness was extended, not because it was required, but because it was possible. The women had feared Christmas and captivity. They had expected cruelty, humiliation, despair. What they received instead was a holiday they never expected, a holiday that reminded them, in the midst of defeat, that hope was not yet dead, that the world, for all its horrors, still had room for light. And the decades that followed, as Germany rebuilt and reconciled with its past, as the women grew old and told their stories, that Christmas became a symbol, not of American superiority, but of human decency. Not of victory, but of connection. Not of what divides us, but of what, against all odds, can still bring us together. The war taught many lessons. It taught the cost of hatred, the danger of ideology unchecked, the fragility of civilization. But it also taught, in small, quiet ways, that even in the darkest times, there are those who choose to light a candle, who refuse to let cruelty have the final word, who insist, stubbornly, beautifully, that humanity is worth preserving. That Christmas in the chateau was one such moment. A flickering light in a long, dark winter. A reminder that even enemies can become, if only for a night, something more. Something better. Something human. And in remembering it, we remember what we are capable of when we choose to be.